It was just after sunset in Culiacán, the kind of evening where the sky still held streaks of orange, and the streets pulsed with the ordinary noise of traffic, vendors, and families heading home. But beneath that normal rhythm, something unnatural was brewing. A city that had grown used to living in the shadows of the world's most powerful cartel was about to witness its darkest night. What began as whispers on radios and sudden, nervous phone calls would soon become thunder, thunder made not by storms, but by bullets tearing across neighborhoods. No one in Culiacán knew that by midnight, their streets would no longer belong to them. They would belong to war. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the first reports came in. Vehicles blocking intersections. Heavily armed men emerging from convoys. Not in the outskirts, not in secret, but in broad daylight, in the heart of the city. These were not small groups of gunmen. They were coordinated, organized, and ruthless. They had one objective: to paralyze Culiacán. And they succeeded. The Sinaloa Cartel, long feared but rarely seen in such force, turned the city into a battlefield. Entire neighborhoods heard the staccato rhythm of machine guns echoing against buildings. Drivers abandoned cars on highways. Families locked themselves inside their homes, praying the gunfire would pass them by. But it didn't. That night, no corner of the city was safe. Imagine being trapped in your living room with your children, listening as bullets rattled against nearby walls. Imagine seeing men in black tactical gear dragging barricades across streets you walked every morning. For the people of Culiacán, this wasn't imagination. This was reality. As night deepened, the violence spread like fire on dry grass. Bridges became choke points. Roads were blocked with burning vehicles. Gunmen didn't just occupy space, they dominated it, forcing the entire city into submission. And all the while, terrified civilians documented what they could with shaky cell phone cameras, capturing a city under siege. The military was called in, but even seasoned soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered. Armored convoys rolled through neighborhoods, exchanging fire with cartel forces that seemed to appear from everywhere at once. It wasn't just chaos. It was strategy. The cartel knew the city better than anyone, and they used it as their weapon. For the people trapped inside, time felt different. Minutes stretched into hours. Each explosion, each burst of gunfire, felt like the beginning of the end. Parents shielded their children with their own bodies. Doctors rushed to overflowing hospitals with no guarantee they'd return home alive. And above it all, the city itself seemed to tremble. But the truth is, this night wasn't just about violence. It was about power. The gunfire, the roadblocks, the bodies hung from bridges, they were all part of a message. A message not only to the government, but to the world. The Sinaloa Cartel would not be underestimated, not even for a moment. And yet, in the middle of all this, thousands of ordinary people found ways to survive. Some hid in darkened rooms, whispering prayers. Others fled the city with nothing but the clothes on their backs. For them, the memory of that night is not a headline. It is a wound. This is the story of the night the Sinaloa Cartel turned Culiacán into a war zone. A story of fear and survival, of ruthless ambition, and of a city caught in the crossfire of a battle it never asked for. Stay with me, because to understand what truly happened that night, we have to go back. Back to the calm before the storm.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Before the first bullet was fired, before the smoke rose over Culiacán, the city moved to the rhythm of ordinary life. Streets were crowded with honking taxis, children weaving between fruit stalls, and the smell of roasted corn drifting from corner vendors. On the surface, it was a night like any other. A city alive, unaware of the storm waiting beyond the horizon. But in Culiacán, normalcy is never truly normal. The city lives with a quiet shadow, the presence of the Sinaloa Cartel. It is an influence woven into daily life, the fancy SUVs parked outside humble homes, the sudden bursts of wealth in neighborhoods where poverty is the norm, the whispered names never spoken too loudly. Everyone knew who really held power here, but few dared to say it. The Sinaloa Cartel wasn't just a gang. It was a system, a parallel authority, moving silently in the spaces where the state could not, or would not, reach. They built schools, paid for church renovations, handed out food. For some, this shadow power meant stability. For others, it meant fear, extortion, or sudden disappearances. But for everyone, it meant compromise. To live here was to coexist with the cartel's invisible hand. Inside the cartel, factions coexisted in a fragile balance. Older lieutenants who had served for decades sat alongside younger, more aggressive commanders eager to prove themselves. The streets knew their nicknames. Whispers in cantinas carried their reputations. Each man controlled his slice of the city, his crew, his debts, and his enemies. For years, this balance held, tense, fragile, but unbroken. And yet, tension lingered just beneath the surface. A missing shipment here. A dispute over routes there. Rumors of betrayals whispered into cell phones late at night. The kind of pressure points that, in most places, would be settled with words. But in Culiacán, disputes were not resolved with conversation. They were resolved with force. For the ordinary citizens, daily survival meant learning invisible boundaries. Which streets to avoid at night. Which questions not to ask. Which cars not to follow too closely. The people of Culiacán developed an instinct, a sixth sense, to read the tension in the air, to know when silence was safer than curiosity. Officials walked the same tightrope. The police patrolled, but everyone knew which corners were off limits. Judges signed papers, but behind closed doors, decisions were influenced by fear or by envelopes of cash. Even the highest offices in Sinaloa carried the unspoken understanding, defy the cartel, and pay the price. Still, life went on. The city thrived in its own way, music spilling from bars, children laughing in courtyards, fireworks marking celebrations. To an outsider, Culiacán looked vibrant, resilient, alive. But to those who lived here, the joy was always edged with caution. A fragile peace, built on silence, money, and fear. It was this fragile peace that made what came next so shocking. When the first reports of roadblocks surfaced, many thought it was just another skirmish, another reminder of who controlled the streets. But this time, it was different. This time, the balance wasn't just shifting. It was breaking. And so, as Culiacán lived its final hours of calm, the question was not if the storm would arrive. The question was when. And when it did, it would consume the entire city. In a single night, ordinary life would vanish, replaced by the sound of gunfire echoing through the streets. October 17, 2019. It began like any other Thursday in Culiacán. Shops opened their doors, workers filled the buses, and children hurried into classrooms. The city seemed calm, but that calm was about to be shattered. Around midday, Mexican security forces carried out an operation deep in the city's Tres Rios neighborhood. Their target, Ovidio Guzmán López, son of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, heir to the Sinaloa Cartel empire. The soldiers moved in quietly at first, surrounding a modest house. They carried assault rifles, their uniforms crisp, their faces tense. When they stormed the building, they found him, Ovidio himself, a soft-spoken young man, barely 28 years old, sitting inside. It was a capture that should have been a triumph. Instead, it became the spark that ignited chaos. The news spread instantly. Within minutes, messages flew across encrypted radios and cell phones. Commanders called their men. Convoys of cartel gunmen mobilized. Pickup trucks fitted with mounted machine guns began to swarm the streets. To the cartel, this wasn't just an arrest. It was a declaration of war. Eyewitnesses recall the exact moment the first shots rang out. A mother walking her child home from school described hearing a deafening crack, then screams, then the chaos of people running in every direction. Drivers abandoned their cars on the main avenues, fleeing for safety as gunmen appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Within an hour, the city was unrecognizable. Roadblocks of burning cars appear on major intersections. Armed men dragged civilians from vehicles, seizing cars and buses to use as barricades. Smoke rose into the sky as entire neighborhoods were cut off, transformed into battle zones. In those moments, fear rippled through the population. Families hid in their homes, peeking through curtains as convoys of masked men roared past. Teachers locked classroom doors, keeping children on the floor to shield them from stray bullets. For the people of Culiacán, survival became the only priority. Meanwhile, cartel gunmen surrounded military installations, trapping soldiers inside. Videos captured the chilling reality: young men barely out of their teens carrying heavy weapons, firing openly at armored vehicles in broad daylight. Civilians filmed from rooftops, their voices trembling as the city they knew dissolved into terror. Eyewitnesses describe phone calls filled with desperation. Fathers trapped in traffic jams as gunfire erupted around them. Mothers begging for news of their children stranded across the city. Every voice carried the same fear: no one knew where it was safe anymore, because nowhere was safe. Inside command rooms, military leaders realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. They had Ovidio in custody, but the city was falling apart around them. Thousands of lives were at risk. And as the minutes ticked by, the cartel's firepower only grew stronger, their demands more urgent. Release him, or the city burns. In the span of a single afternoon, the fragile peace of Culiacán collapsed. The arrest of one man had unleashed a storm that no one could control. Gunfire echoed through the city, smoke blackened the skies, and civilians were caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. That single spark, the arrest of Ovidio Guzmán, had lit the fuse for a war. By late afternoon, the sound of gunfire was no longer confined to one neighborhood. It spread like wildfire. Every corner of Culiacán seemed to echo with the rattle of automatic rifles, the crack of sniper fire, and the deafening roar of mounted machine guns. What began as a single confrontation had erupted into a citywide war. Neighborhoods once filled with ordinary life became battlegrounds. In Las Quintas, parents crouched with their children as bullets smashed through windows. In the Humaya district, residents watched convoys of armed men seize intersections, cutting off entire blocks with burning vehicles. No street was safe. No corner untouched. As the cartel tightened its grip, they made their message brutally clear. Armed groups began dragging civilians from their vehicles, sometimes at random, sometimes as hostages. Others were used to build barricades, their cars set ablaze to choke off military reinforcements. Eyewitnesses recall the smell of burning rubber and the terrifying sight of masked men shouting orders at gunpoint. Reports began to emerge of kidnappings. Soldiers captured by cartel gunmen were paraded through the streets, humiliated on camera, their fates uncertain. Families of military personnel received desperate calls warning them to stay silent, while civilians whispered rumors of executions carried out as warnings. The city was no longer just under attack, it was under control. To enforce their dominance, the cartel turned fear into spectacle. Bodies of rivals and victims were displayed in public, left hanging from bridges, sprawled across intersections, reminders that defiance would be met with death. Videos of these scenes spread instantly on social media, amplifying the terror and showing the world that Culiacán now belonged to them. For civilians trapped inside this nightmare, survival meant silence and shadows. Entire families huddled in bathrooms, whispering prayers as gunfire rattled outside. Shoppers in supermarkets laid flat on the ground for hours, children crying quietly as parents covered their mouths. No one dared step outside unless forced, because the streets belonged to the cartel. Meanwhile, the cartel's tactics revealed a chilling level of coordination. Dozens of convoys moved simultaneously, communicating through encrypted radios. Roadblocks were strategically placed at bridges and highways, cutting off military routes. Armored vehicles, many homemade, rolled through neighborhoods. It was not random chaos. It was a calculated strategy, and it worked. Eyewitnesses described the sense of complete abandonment. police patrols vanished, overwhelmed by the firepower. Emergency responders struggled to reach the wounded, often forced to turn back under heavy fire. Hospitals overflowed with injured civilians as doctors worked tirelessly, knowing more would arrive with every passing minute. And still, the violence escalated. From rooftops and intersections, cartel snipers controlled entire zones, preventing soldiers from advancing. Convoys of civilians were trapped for hours, unable to flee as firefights raged on every side. Social media lit up with desperate pleas, families begging for rescue, students trapped in universities, entire neighborhoods screaming for help that never came. In less than 3 hours, the Sinaloa Cartel had transformed Culiacán into a war zone. Roads were sealed, soldiers were surrounded, and the government's control of the city crumbled in real time. For the first time in decades, the balance of power was visible on the streets. The cartel ruled the day. But as night approached, the stakes would rise even higher, and the world would watch as the government faced an impossible decision. The violence that erupted in Culiacán wasn't random. It was a coordinated military-style operation, executed with precision. Analysts later said it resembled an insurgency more than a criminal gang response. In less than an hour, the Sinaloa Cartel had mobilized hundreds of men, dozens of vehicles, and an arsenal that rivaled small armies. Their playbook was clear: overwhelm, outmaneuver, and outlast the state. Communication was the backbone of their success. Using encrypted radios, burner phones, and lookouts scattered across the city, the cartel relayed every movement of the military. Young men, sometimes teenagers, acted as halcones, falcons, perched on rooftops or riding motorcycles, reporting troop positions in real time. Nothing the army did went unseen. Their weapons arsenal shocked observers. Heavy machine guns mounted on reinforced trucks, Narco tanks, rolled through the streets. Rocket-propelled grenades and high-caliber rifles were deployed with ruthless efficiency. These weren't street-level thugs firing blindly. These were trained units, coordinating suppressive fire, setting ambushes, and forcing the military onto the defensive. Security analysts later revealed that many of the weapons in Culiacán that day weren't homemade. They were imported, smuggled in from across the border. AR-15s, AK-47s, Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifles capable of piercing armored vehicles. Some came directly from the United States through vast trafficking networks, turning Culiacán streets into a battlefield armed with foreign firepower. One of the cartel's deadliest tactics was the ambush. Convoys of soldiers moving through the city found themselves boxed in by burning vehicles, with cartel gunmen firing from rooftops and alleyways. Every movement was anticipated, every escape route blocked. Soldiers described being trapped under relentless fire, their armored vehicles riddled with bullets, their radios filled with desperate calls for reinforcements. In some cases, cartel units lured soldiers into kill zones, opening fire only once the military was trapped. Videos later surfaced of heavily armed men advancing in formation, firing with discipline, then retreating as backup forces approached. This was not chaos. This was a coordinated chess match, with every move designed to break the enemy's will. Even the city's geography was used as a weapon. Narrow streets, bridges, and choke points were blocked, forcing military units into predictable paths. High vantage points became sniper nests, while cartel convoys dominated open boulevards. It was urban warfare in its purest form, and the government was losing. Security experts who studied the siege later said the cartel's coordination rivaled that of professional militaries. Some speculated that cartel gunmen had trained abroad, or had received guidance from ex-military commanders. Whatever the source, their efficiency on that day left the Mexican government stunned. Entire sectors of Culiacán were effectively cut off, controlled not by the state, but by the cartel. And yet, for all the tactical brilliance, for all the precision in their maneuvers, it was not the soldiers or the gunmen who bore the greatest burden. It was the civilians. Families trapped in crossfire, children hiding under desks, entire neighborhoods transformed into prisons. The cartel may have outplayed the military, but the innocent paid the price. As night fell, the smoke over Culiacán thickened. The city was sealed, the military cornered, and the government faced a choice it had never wanted to confront. But civilians were the ones who paid most. By nightfall, the battle for Culiacán had already scarred the city beyond recognition. But behind the smoke, the gunfire, and the convoys, there was another story unfolding, a quieter one, hidden inside homes, hospitals, and whispered phone calls. It was the story of ordinary people caught in the crossfire, clinging to life as the city around them fell into war. In one neighborhood, a young mother named Lucia huddled in her bathroom with her 2 children. Bullets slammed into the walls outside, plaster falling from the ceiling. Her voice cracked as she whispered into her phone, "Don't cry, mi amor, don't cry, we'll be safe soon." For hours, she stayed on the floor, shielding her children with her own body, praying for silence that never came. In another part of the city, Jorge, a delivery driver, was trapped in his truck when the first roadblocks went up. He described watching armed men set vehicles on fire around him, their rifles silhouetted against the flames. He called his wife, telling her he might not make it home. His final words before hanging up, "Take care of the kids. Tell them I love them." Inside hospitals, the scenes were overwhelming. Ambulances screeched to the doors, dropping off the wounded in waves. Doctors worked with trembling hands, their white coats stained red as they struggled to keep up. Operating rooms overflowed. Families pressed against walls and hallways, crying out for news of their loved ones. The hospital itself had become another battlefield, this one fought against time. Phone lines lit up with desperate calls to emergency services. One recording, later leaked online, captured the trembling voice of a child whispering into the phone, "They're outside. Please, send someone." The operator tried to calm them, but there was nothing to promise. The city was too dangerous for rescuers to reach every home. Many calls went unanswered. Some civilians were forced to take unimaginable risks. A father, clutching his wounded son, drove through streets riddled with gunfire, weaving between burning barricades to reach the nearest clinic. He later recalled the sound of bullets striking his car, glass shattering, his son crying in the back seat. Every second was a gamble, but he made it, barely. Survivors who managed to flee described the silence of hiding. Families laying flat on supermarket floors, children muffling their sobs. Shop owners locking metal shutters and waiting in darkness. A taxi driver recounted crouching under his dashboard as gunmen sprayed bullets across the avenue. "The air smelled of fire," he said. "I thought it would never end." Medics risked their lives too. Ambulance crews darted into hot zones, often under fire, to pull out the wounded. One paramedic, exhausted and trembling, admitted later that he thought he wouldn't survive the night. But he kept driving back into danger, because he couldn't leave people to die on the streets. The weight of the violence fell heaviest on children. In classrooms, teachers kept students hidden under desks for hours, whispering stories to calm them as the sounds of war echoed outside. One child later said, "I thought it was the end of the world." For many, that day left scars they would carry forever. As the night deepened, survivors emerged from hiding. Some found their homes destroyed, others learned their loved ones would never return. For the city of Culiacán, the physical damage could be rebuilt. But the human toll, the fear, the grief, the broken families, would linger like an open wound. While the streets of Culiacán burned, behind closed doors the real story of power was unfolding. The war wasn't random chaos. It was deliberate, triggered by a struggle at the very top of the cartel hierarchy. At the heart of it lay a question whispered across Mexico's underworld: who truly controls the Sinaloa Cartel? For years, the organization built by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had fractured into competing factions after his arrest and extradition. On one side, his sons, known as Los Chapitos, young, ruthless, eager to claim their father's empire. On the other, seasoned commanders loyal to older leaders, determined to preserve the old order. Between them, fragile truces, and endless betrayals. Intercepted communications later revealed fragments of the cartel's internal dialogue. Coded messages sent over encrypted radios. Orders whispered in the dead of night. An informant described a chilling directive: Make the government bleed. Show them who owns Culiacán. This was not just about survival, it was about domination. The trigger that sparked the violence was the attempted capture of one of El Chapo's sons. For the Chapitos, losing him meant losing face, losing leverage, losing everything. To prevent that, they unleashed their full arsenal, hundreds of armed men, convoys, roadblocks. But behind the fury, another layer of calculation was at play. Factional rivalries fed the fire. Some commanders saw opportunity in the chaos. If the government's assault broke the Chapitos, another wing of the cartel could rise. For every bullet fired on the street, there was a conversation in a backroom about money, territory, and power. And those conversations decided who lived and who died. One informant later recalled hearing laughter over the radio, commanders mocking how easily the city was brought to its knees. To them, the siege wasn't just a defense. It was a demonstration, proof that the cartel could outgun the state, anytime, anywhere. A performance of power designed to terrify the government and reassure their own ranks. Security analysts argue that what unfolded was more than just loyalty to a captured leader. It was strategy. By forcing the government to retreat, the cartel not only freed their man, they also sent a message to rivals inside and outside the organization: we are untouchable. It was as much an internal power move as it was a battle with the state. But inside the cartel, there were no unified cheers. Old guard commanders saw the Chapitos' recklessness as dangerous, drawing too much heat, too quickly. Whispers spread that the war had not been fought for the cartel, but for the ego of a few young heirs. And those whispers threatened to fracture the organization even further. Who, then, stood to gain from the bloodshed? The Chapitos, who preserved their grip and proved their strength. Rival factions, who could exploit the backlash to weaken them later? Or perhaps the government itself, which could use the chaos to justify new crackdowns and secure international support. In the cartel's world, every death carried a price tag, and someone always paid. Inside the cartel, power is never stable, never secure. Every move is both survival and betrayal. And on that day in Culiacán, the streets ran red not only because of a rescue, but because of a question that remains unanswered: who really controls the Sinaloa Cartel? As the streets of Culiacán descended into chaos, the Mexican state was forced into motion. Sirens echoed across the city as convoys of police and soldiers mobilized. From the outside, it looked like an army was rolling in to reclaim the streets. But inside command centers, the mood was far less confident. The government had been caught off guard, blindsided by the scale of the uprising. Phone lines burned with frantic calls. State officials demanded reports. Local commanders admitted the unthinkable: the cartel had seized control of major roads, choked off entry points, and pinned down units. Soldiers weren't advancing. They were retreating, cornered in their own city. The government was fighting not from a position of strength, but survival. By late afternoon, it was clear the state was outmaneuvered. Armored vehicles were ambushed. Police stations came under fire. Soldiers ran low on ammunition. Every attempt to push into cartel-controlled zones was met with overwhelming force. Analysts would later call it one of the darkest days for Mexico's security forces, not just because of the violence, but because of the fear spreading inside their ranks. Meanwhile, the Mexican president and top officials convened in emergency meetings hundreds of miles away. Intelligence poured in, each report worse than the last. A chilling realization spread: not only had the cartel outgunned them, but civilians were now hostages to the chaos. The government's next move would decide whether the city lived or burned. As hours passed, strategic failures became undeniable. Some military units were stranded without orders. Others received conflicting commands. Should they strike hard and risk civilian casualties? Or should they retreat and risk humiliation? Every minute of hesitation cost lives, and every decision, or lack of one, deepened public anger. In neighborhoods across Culiacán, families huddled in fear as gunfire rattled outside their doors. Social media filled with videos of burning vehicles, panicked voices, and desperate pleas for help. The public wasn't just afraid of the cartel anymore, they were angry at a government that seemed powerless, or unwilling, to protect them. By evening, the debate reached its breaking point. Generals urged an aggressive counterstrike, no matter the cost. Civilian officials pushed back, fearing a bloodbath that would leave thousands dead. And above them all, the president faced a decision that would define his administration: continue the fight against overwhelming odds, or order a retreat. When the decision finally came, it stunned the nation. The government ordered security forces to stand down. The captured cartel leader, the spark of the day's violence, was released. Soldiers pulled back. The shooting slowed. Just like that, the siege ended. But the silence that followed was not relief, it was disbelief. Some called it a strategic move, a necessary step to save civilian lives. Others called it the ultimate act of surrender, proof that the Mexican state had bowed to the will of the cartel. Whichever the truth, one reality was undeniable: the events of that night exposed the limits of government power and the reach of cartel influence. And as the news broke, outrage swept across Mexico. How could the state, with its army and its authority, retreat before a criminal syndicate? How could a city be handed back to the very men who set it ablaze? In living rooms, cafes, and crowded streets, the same question echoed: was this strategy, or surrender? When the last shots faded and the smoke cleared, Culiacán was left in ruins, not of buildings, but of trust, of safety, of ordinary life. The war had ended as suddenly as it began, yet its scars would not fade so quickly. The official death toll remained unclear. Some said dozens. Others whispered of far more. Families searched hospitals, morgues, and rubble-strewn streets for missing loved ones. Mothers carried photographs of sons who had never returned. Each number on a government report was a story of a life cut short. In the days that followed, arrests were promised. Investigations were launched. Yet little came of them. Few names were made public. Even fewer faced trial. For many in Culiacán, the message was clear: justice, like safety, was something that belonged only to those with power. But the most visible wound was psychological. Culiacán was never the same. Children who had once played in open streets now flinched at the sound of fireworks. Families who had called the city home for generations quietly packed their belongings and disappeared, displaced by fear more than violence. Shops that survived the siege shuttered their doors. Schools closed early, haunted by memories of gunfire outside their walls. Entire neighborhoods carried the silence of trauma. Even when life appeared to move on, a glance, a whisper, or a sudden noise could drag it all back. Survivors spoke of the long nights afterward, the sleepless hours spent listening for distant gunshots, waiting for the nightmare to return. They spoke of unanswered questions. Why did the state retreat? Why were civilians abandoned? Why did no one pay for what had been done? Historians would later call it a turning point. Security analysts named it a humiliation. But to those who lived through it, it was something simpler and far heavier, a wound that cut into the soul of a city. A reminder that in the war between cartels and the state, ordinary people bore the weight of both. And justice? Justice never truly arrived. Promises faded. Files gathered dust. Families continued to wait. For them, the aftermath was not counted in arrests or investigations, but in empty chairs at dinner tables, in birthdays uncelebrated, in lives forever divided by a single night of terror. In Culiacán, the war ended in hours. But for its people, the aftermath lasted years. And for some, it never ended at all. And so the story of that day was written not only in bullets and blood, but in silence, in absence, in lives forever changed. The night the cartel turned Culiacán into a war zone may have ended, but its shadows stretch far into the future. In the end, the question remained: who truly benefited from the night Culiacán was turned into a war zone? For the Chapitos, the answer seemed obvious: their brother freed, their dominance secured, their enemies silenced. For the Sinaloa Cartel as a whole, the message was louder than any bullet: the state could be bent, forced, even humiliated, by sheer firepower. It was a victory written in smoke and fear. But beneath the triumph, cracks spread. Rival factions bided their time, waiting for the day when the Chapitos' recklessness would backfire. Allies questioned whether such open warfare brought too much attention, too much pressure. In the underworld, even victory can plant the seeds of downfall. In the state? Officials declared that lives had been spared by releasing the captive. But critics saw only surrender. To the public, it looked less like a calculated move, and more like an admission that the government no longer held the monopoly on power. For a democracy, there are wounds deeper than defeat on the battlefield. There is the loss of faith. In Culiacán's streets, the people were left with nothing but memory. A city that once pulsed with music, markets, and life was scarred by silence. Burnt vehicles rusted where they had fallen. Bullet holes pocked the walls. Each scar a reminder that for one night, their city was not their own. For the families of the dead, there was no benefit, no lesson, no closure. Only absence. Children growing up without fathers. Parents burying their sons. Empty chairs at kitchen tables. For them, the aftermath was not measured in politics or strategy, but in grief. Historians would later write that the Battle of Culiacán was a watershed moment, the day Mexico confronted the scale of cartel power. But for those who lived it, the legacy was far more personal. Trauma carried in silence. Trust broken between people and state. A city forever changed. Who benefited? Perhaps the cartels, who proved themselves untouchable. Perhaps corrupt officials, who could exploit the chaos. But for the ordinary people of Culiacán, there was nothing gained. Only fear. Only silence. Only the haunting knowledge that if it happened once, it could happen again. And so, the story closes where it began, in a city that for one night became a battlefield, a city where the line between state and cartel blurred until it vanished. What began with gunfire ended in silence. What began as a rescue ended as a revelation. The balance of power had shifted. For Mexico, that night remains a mirror. A reflection of a war without end, a struggle without victors, a question without answers. For Culiacán, it remains a wound, open and unhealed. And for the world, it is a reminder of what happens when the state loses control, and the shadows step into its place. One night, a lifetime of echoes. The night the Sinaloa Cartel turned Culiacán into a war zone will never be forgotten. Not by the government. Not by the cartel. And certainly not by the people who lived it. Because when power is written in blood, its echoes never fade. If this story shook you, don't let it disappear into silence. Hit that like button so more people see the truth. Subscribe right now, because there are more stories, hidden, dangerous, and real, that the world needs to hear. And share this video, so that the echoes of Culiacán are not forgotten. Your voice matters. Together, we keep the shadows from rewriting history.